cities are about people. If you have this people lens on, then you realize that cities have to meet the needs of these people in many ways. I think that a smart city is one that will use all of the years of thinking and experience that have gone into creating cities in the past, as well as other developments that there might be today.
So a lot of smart city projects are literally, 50 lakh rupees, that kind of project. Parks have been created for the differently abled children in Vizag. Renewable energy kinds of projects have been done. So what we have today is a whole plethora of solutions. Now the smartness will come if the citizens of our living in our cities really start demanding.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the City Champions podcast. Today, we're thrilled to host two incredible voices in the urban transformation space. Today, we have Jagan Shah, who is the CEO of Infravision Foundation, and Anuj Bhagwati, who is the director of the A.T.E group along with the A.T.E Chandra Foundation. Great. Hi, Anuj. Hi, Jagan. Thank you so much for being here today. While the government is a significant driver of urban policy, we need collective action from civil society and even individual citizens to bring about meaningful change. And that's what we're here to discuss today. We have the honor of hosting both of you who bring unique and invaluable perspectives to the table. And my first question would be to both of you. Before we dive into the broader vision, I'd like to understand your story and start on a more personal road. Behind urban development, there is usually a personal story. What made you to be a part of this? What was that juncture of your life where you said, okay, urban development and planning is something that I am very passionate about and I want to get into it? Or is there an anecdotal story that you would like to share? We can start with you, Anuj.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank you and Josh Talks for hosting us. Urban is one of those subjects that I'm always happy to talk about. Friends of mine tell me that anything we talk about, if it's sports or if it's housing, suddenly I'll come into connecting it to the urban realm. I personally am an urban person or somebody interested in urban by accident, you could say. I grew up in Bombay, in Mumbai now, and I was a student there, lived my life, didn't really think too much about the city, just about the parts of the city that I was interacting with in my life, which had just evolved.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very intentional as to what I was doing with the city, how I was engaging with it. I went away to study as an undergraduate for 6.5 years because I stayed on for graduate school as well. And I was, for these 6.5 years, primarily in a small town in the United States. And that's when I started thinking about where I was and what I could do in this place, because it was a new place. And so you start thinking about it again. And it was a small town, but it had really quite incredible public infrastructure.
Okay.
And it had a lot of natural beauty that the city was really built around. And so you start doing things differently. You go for a lot of walks, there's public transport, there's playgrounds that are accessible to everyone. I was so excited with these playgrounds that when I was 18 years old and I was there, I was going to the kids' playgrounds because they were so wonderful. And you also see a lot of social and educational infrastructure that is open to everybody. Libraries, many other facilities, open spaces, parks, playgrounds, you name it, it was all there. And so you start thinking about, why is it that I can do all these things here but not back home, in my city? So when I returned to Bombay in the mid-90s, I started working with a bunch of social organizations. That was something that had been the norm in my family. And we were helping with waste management and all kinds of other stuff. And out of that, we set up a non-profit called Praja,
Okay.
the Praja Foundation. And by chance, then I ran into Rahul Mehrotra, and he was reviving the Urban Design Research Institute, which had been set up by a bunch of Bombay luminaries, including Charles Correa. And he was working with that platform. And he said, "Why don't you come and join some of our meetings, public events?" And that was how I got interested in urban issues, and got involved now 25 years plus with many different urban themes.
Perfect. Jagan?
I have a somewhat different experience than Anuj's. I used to do a lot of theater since I was 12 years old. And I lived in Delhi all along. I've gone to school here, went to college here, and I discovered this city as a place where one could literally be free to move around, to access people of all kinds. One did theater, so not only were we as a group very close to each other, we came from all different parts of the city. We could travel easily. A 12.5 rupee bus pass in DTC was sufficient for us to roam around the entire city. But also not only use the infrastructure, but also to access the human resource of the city itself, the diversity of people one could interact with.
And what year was this?
This would be starting in 1982, and for 10 continuous years, I was part of a group that wrote our own original plays. A lot of those plays were about events in the city, notably some of the sort of the uglier events that took place in Delhi, especially around 1984. We wrote plays about that. We wrote plays about nuclear disarmament, stuff like that. That as youth was something that excited us. This was a generation, I think, that felt that we could change the world. So that was firstly the formative experience of experiencing a city as a place where you had access to the diversity of people and also the infrastructure that allowed you to roam around, to use cultural spaces, and it was a free city in that fundamental sense. But conceptually, I think a lot of one's inspiration came from a city like Bombay. So when I was an undergrad student of architecture, I wrote a research dissertation on streets, and this is what excited me always about the city. It was the fact that you were walking on a street and you wouldn't know the names of anybody, or you wouldn't know where they came from, but you shared this space and peacefully. And sort of that has been a very formative influence on me. And Bombay was the place where I went to study streets and wrote about it. And then finally, to get some kind of a more formal articulation in one's mind as a graduate student in New York.
Got it.
And I still believe that Manhattan is a supreme product of centuries of thinking about how cities ought to be organized. And that grid plan, for instance, goes back right to the ancient world. Mohenjo-daro had a grid of streets and so on. But one could see how a throbbing economy could actually feed off this kind of urban organization. Where there was a kind of a standardization of the streets and everything in terms of public space. But within that, there were hospitals, universities, cultural centers, homes, playgrounds, a system of organization that could allow everybody to flourish. That left a deep impression on me. And one keeps looking for opportunities to, in a sense, recreate that kind of urban milieu. Which can support people's not only people's creativity, but also a sense of self-discovery.
Super interesting. Thank you. Anuj, smart cities like Pune, Bengaluru, and Surat are talked about as the quote unquote the real deal or the model cities, right? But for most people, smart cities is just a concept, right? That sounds great on paper. With your experience, what does a smart city really look like today, and maybe in the future, what will it look like? And for those living in Indian cities, what kind of improvements can we realistically expect in the coming years?
Well, I would say that the way that I look at smart cities, cities in general, is that cities are about people. And why do I say this? Because many times the focus is on objects like buildings, or on projects, or on technology. If you have this people lens on, then you realize that cities have to meet the needs of these people in many ways. You have basic human needs that need to be met. It could be housing, it could be water, sanitation, open space, sunlight, air. Then you have, of course, educational, health needs. You have all the social needs that actually make cities what they are, the interactions that really catalyze growth and innovation and all those things. So you have all of these needs that cities need to meet. And I think that a smart city is one that will use all of the years of thinking and experience that have gone into creating cities in the past, as well as other developments that there might be today, in order to create efficient, economically efficient, as well as ecologically efficient cities that meet these human needs. So I would say that for me, smart cities are about people, and they're about economic gain as well as ecological, environmental efficiency.
Got it.
All of this.
And from a public infrastructure point of view?
From a public infrastructure point of view, I would say that many of the oldest street innovations are actually turning out to be, from every point of view, very smart ones. So look at footpaths. Every journey begins and ends with some part of it on foot. It's always been like that. From Mohenjo-daro, from the Indus Valley, wherever, you've always had people walking. Now you can eliminate the walking, or you can say let's reduce it to the extent possible, but then you start having problems of health because we're not walking enough, we're not moving enough. Suddenly we're saying, oh, we should do 10,000 steps. But if you made cities that people could walk in, then you would have much healthier people in these cities. Plus, you would have a much lower carbon footprint. So sometimes ideas that are very old can also be very meaningful. And that's something that when we look for technology or technology solutions, we shouldn't forget. So I think that one thing I always tell people is that technology is just one part of all of this. And a city is an ecology, something that really needs all of these very interconnected domains to work together well. Because you can't have more housing and less water. You need all of these things together really to make a good city. And when we focus on the smart and the technology part sometimes in cities, we forget that you can't live under an app, you can't drink from an app, you can't do any of these things from an app. So we have to make sure that we remember what the focus needs to be.
Got it. Jagan, you've been at the heart of the Smart Cities mission, so you have a unique view of what's actually happening on ground. There's a lot of talk about how smart cities will transform daily life, reducing traffic, improving public services, making neighborhoods cleaner and safer. But for an average person living in these cities, these changes can still feel far off. Can you give us a reality check? How far are we, or how close are we from having these cities actually feel smarter and more efficient in ways that people can actually see and feel?
That's a great question. And I want to just add to what Anuj has said. I'm in full agreement with everything Anuj has said, and particularly the point that smart cities are about people. When we were devising the mission at the Ministry of Urban Development, some officers would ask the question, hey, isn't smart cities about smart people? But you couldn't launch a government program saying we're going to create smart people. What you needed to do was to leverage the technical knowledge that's available in the country, create a market for new technologies that can help cities to deliver the water as well as deliver housing of good quality, to monitor our environmental performance, to do a whole range of things that we weren't doing at that point. Cities in the imagination of the technocrats in the country, and in fact the public almost had no real sort of articulation of what the city is for them. They were users of the city. But for the technocrats, cities were still about master plans and maybe a little bit about, making provision in your annual plans for some money to be spent on a flyover or such like. What the Smart Cities mission tried to do was to disrupt that business as usual, which was not to look at the city as merely a place that you executed projects, but a city where communities could be brought together to voice their opinion on what they believe are their priorities. So what is unique, and in fact some of the achievements of the Smart Cities mission in fact are unseen, and that's probably the reason why it is thought of as having failed. But I feel obliged to defend it because it's very much something that I was closely involved in. And I would say that one of the big achievements has been, one, to raise much more awareness about the multiple dimensions of the city, whether it is mobility or environmental management or pedestrian spaces and cycle tracks, as well as smart solutions for various other infrastructure and municipal services. We've achieved a lot in that sense because the market has evolved. The last 10 years has seen a market formation role that the mission has played. Again, it's an unseen achievement, but today we are poised to deploy almost every advanced, when I say advanced, I don't mean expensive, advanced technology for servicing people's needs, whether they are mobility needs or they are water, energy, even housing, for instance, and a host of other things, even access to education. Some cities have experimented with projects related to e-classrooms in their municipal schools. That opens the possibility for that same school to actually reach out to a much larger pool of students. So there's a lot of unfinished work. Having said that, a mission can only achieve so much.
Absolutely.
And I think we have certainly created the disruption through 100 different cities devising 100 different sets of projects that they want to do. And these range from a city like Raipur, which decided to create, and these were very small, they're not expensive projects, but decided to create a wall which had alas or little sort of shelves in it, where you could leave your used clothes and people would come and pick it up. But to celebrate the act of sort of repurposing and recycling things, or vendors being managed and a certain aesthetic created for vending zones. So a lot of smart city projects are literally 50 lakh rupees, that kind of project. Parks have been created for the differently abled children in Vizag. Energy, renewable energy kinds of projects have been done. So what we have today is a whole plethora of solutions. Now the smartness will come if the citizens of our living in our cities really start demanding that smartness to be manifest in every single operation of the city. One last point I would make is that the mission was launched with the intent of only looking at one small area within the city and to upgrade it completely. So what you will find is not an entire city having become smart, because that's almost an impossibility. You cannot do that. It has to be incremental. And all the cities have proposed plans for replicating whatever success they achieve in a small area. Take a city like Warangal. Warangal has a wonderful lake and a fort overlooking it. That was one of their key projects. Now they want to expand from that to look at other water bodies and how to restore those water bodies, make them more tourism friendly. So the idea of scaling up now from all of these 8,000 plus lighthouse projects, that's where the next 5 to 10 years ought to focus. And it will be entirely about what citizens demand, because the mission started with the Minister of Urban Development, in fact, traveling around the world, telling the world that 6 million people have participated in stakeholder consultations. They have identified which projects. And in most cities, that is really the case. In some places, there simply wasn't enough of a quorum for them to really deliberate enough. But in almost all of the 100 cities, it is citizens that selected the projects that needed to be done. They said, we want cycle tracks. They said, we want a better parking infrastructure. They said, we want to repurpose a market like in Indore, a market that is repurposed at night. It's a market that's basically for jewelry in the daytime, and then at night it becomes a place for recreation. Now, these concepts did not exist before that in urban discourse. We knew them because we had traveled around the world. We'd seen how smart other countries are about using their urban infrastructure and public spaces, but we hadn't done it in our own country. Today, we've got Indian examples of almost every, I could say confidently, almost every innovation that one can think of in the whole host of infrastructure and services required in cities. We have a pilot. Now, can we scale it? And how smart is government going to be about scaling all of it and delivering that to all citizens? That's the big question now for the government to ask. And for the citizens, I think the question is, get involved. You know, it's ultimately going to be about that. It is a systems view, like Anuj was describing. Cities are far more complex than we ever thought they would be. But now, as citizens, we need to take that into account and really be part of finding the solutions.
In just layman terms, how do you get citizens involved?
You get citizens involved in a very purposeful way. Say, for instance, some of the most successful attempts at citizen engagement and involvement and participation has been in waste management. The Swachh Bharat mission has succeeded in creating, I think, a widespread awareness that hygiene, cleanliness is good, a cleaner environment is desirable, and that we can act. And I think citizens need to get involved in things that citizens can do, or to give their opinion on what government ought to do. And both these things can be done through digital engagement, simply for the scale of it. But there are many aspects which require much more on-ground engagement as well. And just one point I think that I should also mention, and this is the reason why digital technology was selected as being the backbone of the Smart Cities mission, is that cities don't have the capacity to manage the scale of the scale of operations that they need to manage. They can't plan them. They don't understand how to procure. So the capacity constraint in our cities must be kept in mind. I think most citizens have this kind of vague idea that government can deliver what they want, but we must become sort of more comfortable with the thought that actually government is constrained. It doesn't have the people actually on the ground, the boots on the ground, to deliver everything that we want them to deliver, which means that the citizens can supplement government's capacity, but also help to raise. So I think one thing that we must keep in mind is that we assume as residents of a city that the local government has the capacity to deliver all of our, deliver to all of our demands. And that assumption is actually incorrect. Governments at the local level usually in India, including metropolitan areas, are understaffed. They don't have the right kind of technical staff as well. And therefore, they do need the community to sort of step up and be part of finding the solutions to local problems. And therefore, again, digital technology can help us aggregate both solutions that the citizens have in mind, but also to maintain the feedback loop with them, simply because the scale of the populations that live in our cities is such that one-on-one or community level interface is very difficult to do. And again, the municipality won't have the skills to even convene that conversation. The way that you're convening this conversation between the two of us, we need to think of that being multiplied thousands of times. So how does one then have those conversations and set up those feedback loops? And I think those are the kinds of small changes that have come about. A municipal website today must have a grievance redressal, tab where you can upload Governments like Andhra Pradesh started with the innovation that within 24 hours, every grievance has to be addressed, a response has to be sent to the citizen. That's 10 years ago. We've already moved way beyond that. And now with artificial intelligence, we'll be able to even create sort of intelligent analysis of the data that's coming from citizens. So there are many things that we can do where the citizens have to get involved.
Got it. Thank you for that. The major chunk of this conversation will be around how can we get more funds into the urban development? How can we enable organizations that are working in the urban development space from a more monetary perspective? And the first aspect of it is, of course, philanthropic investments. Anuj, you've been a vocal advocate for philanthropy in the urban sector. How do you view the role of philanthropy in one, enabling urban development, be developing urban development?
Okay, so these are big questions. Let me try to answer them as best as I can and in a kind of logical manner. I would say the first thing is that urban development is very important. It's important because half the country is soon going to be in urban areas. We are urbanizing rapidly. The second thing is that urbanization presents a huge opportunity for us. It's not something that we should be upset about. It's something that we should recognize as a huge economic opportunity for us, because around the world, in India as well, urbanization has happened because of people seeing more economic opportunity in cities, and for cities being multipliers of this economic opportunity because of the interactions that we have in cities, because of the fact that many different kinds of people are within close proximity. You can develop many new kinds of products, solutions, businesses. And so this is a huge opportunity, not a problem alone. That said, of course, there are problems today, and that's manifest because if you look at the last census data, we haven't had one since 2011, but in Mumbai, about 42% of the people didn't even have proper housing. So we do have a lot of urban issues that need to be dealt with. So both from the opportunity perspective as well as the issues perspective, this is a huge challenge. So if philanthropy wants to invest and solve the biggest problems that the country is facing and also grab the biggest opportunities, then this is a sector that philanthropy can't be out of. Now, the other thing that I think it's important to understand is that philanthropy can make the kinds of bets sometimes that others can't make. And they can create a lot of pathways for innovation. I think Jagan talked about how the government has done that with so many projects around the country that have been tried out, tested, learnings, good, bad, that could be multiplied. The philanthropic sector can also do the same thing. They can be like the venture arm in trying out certain projects. They can guide some small innovations. They can also look long term at other things that need to be done, because some of the things we might need to do might be of the nature of systems change, thinking change that we need to undertake in order for everybody to benefit. And as Jagan said, cities are really very complicated. Cities are complicated because you have many scales. He talked about how you have looked at some parts of the city to upgrade. But if you just look at a journey that somebody makes from home to work, just think how many scales you're going through. There's the regional transport network that needs to be planned at a regional level, where policies and plans are at that scale. And then finally, you'll take a few modes of transport, each one going through different scales. Roads will be more local, footpaths will be extremely local, street furniture extremely local. So you have a lot of scales. The time scales also are very different. Regional planning projects, regional transport projects will be decades worth of thinking that, I mean, you need to think for decades when you do those projects. Local projects are a much smaller time scale. So because you have so many time scales, so many spatial scales, and so many domains that you need to simultaneously plan for, water, health, etc., etc. I think I went through that laundry list before. It's a very complicated area, and it takes time. If you look at the rejuvenation of the Kala Ghoda area in Mumbai, which is something that people often talk about, the arts and fashion hub now for the city, I think that these are ideas that Rahul and others at the Urban Design Research Institute started working on in the mid 90s. And still so much work to be done. So these things take time. And sometimes philanthropy doesn't have the patience also for that time period. But philanthropy can have the patience for that time period, because sometimes you have to say, I won't look at the short term result, but I'll look at being part of a long term process. And it requires then a mind shift, because it's easy if you give somebody a certain number of vaccines for polio, then you know that you'll have created certain kind of impact. The connection between your action and the impact is pretty clear. Education is something that has long-term impact, but it's something that now more or less culturally we accept that education is a good thing to do. So I want that the urban sector is also recognized by philanthropy in the same way that people see that this is something that you need to do, you need to invest in for the long term, and it's complicated. Companies also have strategies that they create. They have strategy departments, planning departments. So I think that we need to have the same approach towards the urban sector.
And according to you, are there any specific urban issues that are underfunded, right? And how essentially can philanthropy help in bridging this gap?
I would say that every urban sector to me appears to be at some level underfunded. But in my view, really, sometimes these very general things, because the connection between these and a result is sometimes hard to find in a short period of time. So urban planning, urban strategies, things like that, they're a little bit difficult to connect immediately. And it shouldn't also be that these are laundry lists of projects that need to be done, because that again takes away from the people-centeredness. Sometimes these kinds of strategies have to be very much about people and evolving the list of projects rather than coming up with a list of projects. So I think that this sector, because of its little nebulous nature, tends to be underfunded, but it's absolutely critical, because when you have so many different interconnected aspects that you need to take care of to make a great city, a great city must have all of these working together, all of these aspects: education, housing, physical, social. Then you need this kind of strategy planning department. I would say housing somehow is another sector in urban that, if you ask me to choose one more specific, I would say that that's something that I really think is very, very important. Because if you look at the SDGs, when we were walking in, I saw that you have a lot of displays about the Sustainable Development Goals that India and many other countries have signed up to from the UN. Housing is not mentioned, but it underpins many of the other goals that we need to have, that we need to reach. And for example, air quality, education. You can't do any of these well. Water, sanitation, you can't do any of these well actually without taking care of the need for adequate housing. Sometimes we talk about affordable housing in India that only looks at the cost. But because housing is about people, it's not about the object, then you have to make sure that that house, that home, enables people to meet all the needs that they have. And so housing, I would say, is perhaps a little bit more fundamental. Shelter is a little bit more fundamental than the others. And I feel that these are sectors where we need to put some work into. The government has schemes. Why have these schemes not worked to the extent that the government would like, that we as people would like? I think those are questions that we need to ask ourselves.
And Jagan, according to you, so one thing that I found very interesting that you mentioned was, government can only do so much, right? Whether from a feet on street perspective, whether from a funding perspective. According to you, how pivotal does philanthropy become to bridge the funding gap that's been provided by the government, right? And is there any particular way in which philanthropy can sort of bridge this gap?
Okay, I think essentially I don't believe philanthropy can fill the gap.
Okay.
Because what government needs today is to be able to leverage 1 rupee that it spends for 10 rupees that needs to be spent.
Yeah.
I don't think philanthropy can, reasonably fill the gap. What it can do is to create I think, 2 things. One is it can create new types of funds, right? So if it's possible, like the India Climate Collaborative as a model, but I'm not saying whether it works well or not, but to create the kinds of platforms through which larger amounts of money can be available. Because I think one of the perils of philanthropic funding in the urban sector is that you're just literally creating a drop in the ocean, which may be good, may be exemplary, but until it scales, it is not significant and impactful. And scale is everything that we are currently, it's our biggest problem. It's the big elephant in the room. Like I said earlier, we have many pilots, good demonstrations, innovations have been demonstrated. We're not able to scale them. That's why philanthropy should really look at a focused engagement on creating platforms where funds can be aggregated, and then those can be made available to cities, ideally on the same kinds of financial terms that you would get for not commercial lending, but for patient capital. Those kinds of terms, I think, can go a long way. I think there's another important role that philanthropy can play, because it tends to originate in industry and business, is to contribute to the behavior change that cities require. And I don't think enough is done on that. It tends to get siloed into, say, road safety, right? We will invest in road safety and we will teach school children not to drive rashly. Okay. But having said that, you also have captive pools of employees. Now, those are very good because they all live in the city. They're very good pools where behavior change can actually be created, because it does spread. There is the power of one that comes into play. Every individual teaches another individual what to do. We've seen this in environmental education, where children are teaching their parents to be more mindful. There's no reason why an industry that employs 500, 1,000 people shouldn't also train them to live in a city. What does it mean? Do you drive in the lane when you drive? It need not be linked to any other sort of ramifications or consequences, but why don't we use these pools of residents of cities that work in business and industry as a way to actually create the larger awareness about the behavior changes that we need, which ranges from paying taxes, be part of a movement that says we must all pay taxes and charges on infrastructure and services, but also it goes to something as innocuous as training people how to use the street space. We've done that a little bit, right? The behavior change related to not spitting on the street or not throwing litter on the street. We can go a lot more into more detail in different areas of human behavior in cities, because cities only succeed if people behave as if they're part of a common stake, right? They all have stakes in the same city, and they're part of finding the solutions.
And interesting that you mentioned that, but you've been talking about how more people can get involved. Can you elaborate on how important is collective action to transform cities in India? How, the need for more people to get involved. You talked about it across your the answers that you were talking about, but a more in depth, like the critical need for it.
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. Cities exist because of collective action, fundamentally. People, the aggregation that Anuj talked about, of people coming in from different geographies with different skills, with different levels of wealth and, to build a city, they come together and they establish a social contract to share common infrastructure and services, to pay for it, sustain it. And to reap the benefit of what can only come about if people share infrastructure and services. So, in that fundamental sense, you can't actually have a good city without more engaged citizens. However, the opportunities for engagement are limited currently. There's also the psychological phenomenon called alienation, where we feel alienated, especially in metropolitan areas. We don't have a sense of a neighborhood or a community that we belong to. We need to work more on that, but on the grounds of shared rules and obligations, not on touchy-feely issues, or the fact that we live in very ghettoized neighborhoods is a problem. How do we change that? We would need to think about that and debate on that. I think philanthropy can play a big role in that kind of phenomenon, but participation is fundamental. The fact that it's not happening may well be assigned as one of the reasons why our cities are not improving at the pace that they need to improve. Feedback loops, like I mentioned earlier, are crucial. Information asymmetry is a big problem in this space. So citizens have to demand more information, and I don't mean through right to information activism, which may be required in some senses, but simply to create the community level pressure on government to share more information about what can broadly be described as sort of the metabolism of the city, right? And Barcelona became a much smarter city because they treated the city as a metabolic entity, and they literally divided the local corporation into metabolic functions. Those who manage trees, those who manage sewage. These are all parts of the metabolism of the city. So I think the citizens have to be the ones that provide the intelligence that you need, the collective intelligence, to find the solutions. And that's why engagement of citizens was so important for the Smart Cities mission. You needed to at least understand, is there a groundswell of opinion about cleaner streets? Is there a groundswell of opinion about air quality, for instance? Unbeknownst to most people, it was the first mission that actually mandated that air quality management should be part of your menu of activities that you do. It was on the back of a WHO report that came out the same year as the mission was launched, and immediately it was absorbed into the guidelines. To what level of success is something that, like Anuj said, is the jury's out. I mean, have we succeeded? To what level we've succeeded is something we still need to measure. But I think the question about participation is fundamental to improving our cities, and increasingly it's going to be the younger generation that has to be. So I would say that the development of cities, urbanization, all of these are imperatives. I would add that to what Anuj said about opportunity. I think it's an imperative because cities do absorb poverty in many ways. It allows people to find self-determination and self-realization in cities. You have an anonymity which you cannot have in any other form of settlement. But you need to be an aware citizen. And I think what we see in the best cities in the world are citizens that are aware of their cities, not only geographically, but they're aware of the economic functions, the stakes that citizens have in the cultural life of the city, the social life. This has to become a culture, and which is why I'm foregrounding the importance of behavior change. It's not something that I have invented. It's been a focus of government, government's thinking as well. The Economic Survey of 2017, for instance, completely focused on behavior change. Again, that has gone unnoticed, but you can't grow the economy without growing the economic actors. And those economic actors can become much smarter in terms of their choices, which have to be evidence-based. And I think all of this is part of the gamut of issues that we've been discussing.
I think it's a question really of capacity building overall. So what Jagan was talking about citizens being involved in cities, it's partly about capacity of citizens being raised with awareness, with involvement, both. You have to put the time aside. In the same way, I think that in all sectors connected with urban, we need to raise capacity. The cities themselves don't have enough people in management functions to deliver the services that they need. The city governments don't. Our elected representatives also often don't have the capacity. So it's something that we need to help our elected representatives with as well. State governments also don't have the capacity. So the state governments are supposed to devolve powers to the urban local bodies under the constitutional amendment, the 74th constitutional amendment. That also has been stalled. So actually the theme that Jagan raised of capacity in the government and with citizens, it's really actually an issue across the board with all sectors connected with urban. And partly that's because when we had independence from the British, etc., that time we were much more rural than we are today. So we have to adapt. We have to add capacity. I think the government has a couple of reports out on capacity building in the urban sector. We as philanthropy, I think we can come in perhaps and try to help also with training and with public engagement, tools for public engagement. The online complaint management system that you talked about was first set up in the MCGM, the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai, by Praja in the late 90s, and then that became an example for others. So I think that is an example of something that has come from philanthropic efforts.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's basically everyone needs to then come together and solve problems. Would it be possible for you to share specific examples where governments, civil society organizations, private organizations, and people have come together to solve complex urban problems?
Well, I think the most immediate example is one in solid waste management. I think today it has become a norm in Indian cities to do door-to-door collection of garbage. Right. And in some cities, sorted garbage. In a city like Bangalore, there is an NGO that will come to your doorstep and even weigh the garbage that you're giving them. And eventually, once that system has been refined based on a mobile app, we will also be able to discern what is your percentage of different types of waste. So it's an evolutionary kind of system that has come about because the benefit of door-to-door collection was finally established. And you must understand that government had to go through a whole process of discovering what works in the Indian context. And this is also very important, that citizens have to be part of finding solutions, because those solutions have to be site-specific. They have to be city-specific, geography-specific, and so on. So we actually cannot and never intended to transpose solutions from other countries into India, while it sounds like that. But to actually discover local solutions. So I think, I think the key point here will be that we take solutions like in Surat, where they have actually been able to clean their water to a level of recyclable quality, that they are able to now make money from selling it to industries. Right? So there are civic functions as well, which don't normally get noticed by the citizens. I think citizens notice improvements in mobility. They notice improvements in waste management. They're all waiting to see improvements in air quality, which clearly is going to be our biggest hairy problem in the country, even water pollution for that matter. And they are basically, they want space to walk, they want space to have open spaces where you can sit with children and family, and a park where you could do that. So these needs are very basic. I think those have gotten articulated now with citizen engagement in different cities. Jabalpur, for instance, has created an urban space. I mentioned Indore. Again, this has come about because the local citizens wanted something. The repurposing of public space in Indore, for instance, is a total manifestation of shopkeepers coming together and saying, hey, why is our area of business, why does it become a dead place at night? In fact, it's a security hazard, and that was voiced as being one of the reasons why they wanted the city to use the space later.
Yeah.
Now, that is happening in other cities as well. It's not necessarily happening or replicating at the same level. We have examples like in Amritsar, parts of Delhi as well, where shopkeepers, local businesses have demanded pedestrianization of a space. I think the Kalagoda
We've
area
been
in
trying
Mumbai,
for 25 years.
has been trying a lot, although Bombay, South Bombay is well served with a lot of pedestrian space. Having said that, this move towards pedestrianization is another thing. In Vizag, the entire coastal road near the Vizag, the Andhra University, was pedestrianized, and made only accessible for non-motorized transport. So these are all very small wins. Unfortunately, government is not very good with curating the communications that need to go out into the public to tell them that Vizag has created this success. Why don't you try it out in your city? That nudging, the nudge of changing people's behavior to not think of intractable problems in the city, but problems that have been solved elsewhere in India and can be solved in your own neighborhood as well. That will be very crucial.
If I can say a couple
Please,
of things, I like the example that Jagan made of Indore and of solid waste management. Recently, at an ASHRAE event in Jaipur, I had the chance to meet a gentleman, Captain Sunpreet Singh, and he said that he wants to take the lessons learned in Indore as a private citizen to 100 other cities. He wants to help them to learn from Indore's example and clean up. And one of the things that he told me about Indore, I have not gone there, I should do it, but he was talking about a complete alignment. He said from the chief minister to the mayor to everybody in the municipal corporation, and now he said the vigilance of people is what keeps it going. So he says that the whole chain is really focused on this goal. It's something that they've come to expect, and it's something that they demand now. So it's really everybody working together. And I think that's whether it's elected representatives, state government, local government, these are all the actors that we need to align, and I think that's one important learning perhaps for us. And I think the reason I was smiling was because when he was talking about how government needs to do a little bit more to publicize some of the successes, I said maybe we need to have a Josh Talk series focused on government success, because that would be a worthwhile thing for us to do. There are all these examples that we should take and perhaps publicize them.
No, I genuinely am having a lot of fun. I feel like a student as a part of this conversation. But one question that I really wanted to ask both of you since we started talking about this conversation was, how do we get more young people involved? How do we make the urban development, urban sector, an aspirational sector for more young people to come and work in? And that's an open-ended question to both of you.
I think that first thing is that it's critical that young people get involved. As you know, with India's population distribution, we have a lot of young people. So if we want cities to be about people, it means necessarily that cities are really going to be about young people. And old guys like me may not understand exactly what young people want. So it's better that young people are involved to understand and articulate their own needs, their own demands, their own wishes, their own aspirations of the city. So from that point of view, it's crucial. Now, how do we enable this? I think that one thing that we need to do perhaps is to really focus on tools that will allow people to get involved. Young people today are digital natives. It comes as secondhand, or maybe it's part of their DNA, as opposed to for us where we have to think about it. And so maybe these kinds of tools can be tools for engagement. But we also have to really go further and make them tools for empowerment. So we've tried in the various nonprofits that I'm involved with to do a few different things. We have young people becoming aides to elected representatives so that they understand how power works in the city and how it can be used. We've have to create other programs for engagement. We have to create fellowships. We have to create more jobs in this sector. The government is doing that with more recruitment in the urban sector overall and thinking about how do we raise capacity. So I think these are other things that we need to do. And I think fundamentally, if I look back on my time when I started out wanting to do something for the city and trying to learn and do, I was encouraged by a lot of older people. And so we have to really make sure that we are encouraging young people to come forward. Not to say that we are the experts and we know, but to say that we can all work on something like this, because fundamentally I studied physics. I work now in the urban sector on the nonprofit side. And so these are common sense issues. You know, Charles Correa, Rahul Mehrotra, very well-known people, Shirish Patel, they were all very encouraging and always said that the voice of the citizen is important, not only the voice of the expert, because finally this is not, the cities are not for experts, they're for everyone, right? So I think that we have to really encourage people. And the famous consumer advocate M.R. Pai, who set up the All India Bank Depositors Association, did a lot of work for consumer rights in India. He always told me that, he said that unless you wrote a letter about it, Anuj, you don't have the right to talk to anybody about it. So he said, write a letter about it, put it on record, complain about it officially if you think there's a deficiency in service. After that, you can tell your friends that there was a problem. But till you take that little step, you know, don't think that you have earned the right to complain about it. So I think that for us to take these little steps is really important, and for young people to feel that they can make a difference. I think if they have a couple of successes, they'll go on. So try to write that letter, try to engage.
Very true.
Or the email, or the tweet now.
Show up and act. I think to add to everything that Anuj said, and I totally agree with it, I would say that what the youth today need to do is to leverage their hope for the future. You know, unlike the older people who tend to look at the past more, not all of us, thankfully, they need to keep that razor sharp focus on the future, because that is what the youth is uniquely able to do, which is to be hopeful and to possibly see their own sense of agency. And I think one very important thing is for them to develop stake. It is, again, not enough public discourse on this, especially amongst the youth, that whether it is the problem of air quality, or it's the problem of mobility access, or it's the problem of housing, all of it affects their future. So they are the primary stakeholders in the development of our cities, and yet they never surface as primary stakeholders, which is therefore the imperative of getting involved and demanding more. And what is wonderful is not only are they digital citizens, but they're also driven a lot by evidence. In the most innocuous ways. I'm always amazed by how much my children will look at the rating of either a product or a film, which I will not. My opinion on whether I should see a film or buy a product is not shaped by the rating that is given to it. But my children will always look at the rating. There is a sense of, in a sense, being informed by what other people also think, which is fantastic. You know, as you grow, you tend to have more and more individual opinions, but there is a sense of commonality of opinions that develops in the youth, which needs to be leveraged for the positive goal of improving our cities. And that will not happen until you have a stake. You know, we must keep in mind that we use the word sustainability now as if it's a trivial word, but the way that it was defined in the 1980s by the Brundtland Commission, that actually defined sustainability as really a direction to my generation to not do anything that prevents the next generation from being able to achieve their maximum potential. Now, that puts you right at the stake, right at the center of all the stakes in the cities. And I don't think that's articulated well enough. I don't think it's a reality for the youth in our cities. They tend to be sort of laid back, so to speak, about the city, or to treat it as a futility. But that's never the case. The whole history of cities has been about evolution. All cities evolve. Even a city that goes bankrupt, like Detroit in Michigan, actually is now coming back to life. That is something that should give us cause for hope. And I think the youth are the sort of the carriers of hope, which does not always associate with cities. I have to say, cities look a little hopeless, but they will only become better if the youth really get involved en masse.
I think that since so many people are moving to cities, cities are going to get built and cities are going to expand. So we have a chance now to shape the future for the people that are going to live in it, the people that are younger today. So that's something that they shouldn't forget. I think when Jagan was talking about the Brundtland Commission, I was remembering something that Alec Padamsee told me, the famous ad man. He was also very socially active. And Nitai Mehta and I were called by him a bunch of times. He was trying to do something on accountability. And at that time, I remember him telling us once, and he told us this a few times. He said, Anuj, don't have too much respect for guys like me. He said, we have some knowledge, we have some experience, but you shouldn't have too much respect and say yes to everything we say. Because remember that on our watch, we didn't go upwards, we went sideways in India. So he was also one of those people like Charles or Shirish or, Alec was always somebody we had to call Alec. We had to address him as Alec. You always have to call Charles. You always have to call Shirish. Because they said, we don't want that you add too much formality to that. You should be able to tell us what you think. So I think that's really what we have to really try to do, and I think that young people need to come forward. And
I want to just add one thing which just struck me when Anuj was speaking. What is fundamentally at stake is the city as a civic place, right? I don't need to know or want to know your origins in terms of where your family. I don't need to know that. In public space, the three of us are equal as citizens. And therefore, the youth is equal to the Alex and Charleses of the world. They may be 3 times their age. It doesn't really matter. We are all citizens. This is often something I say when I teach a class in a university, which is that, you're old enough to vote. If the country has given you the right to vote, there is no bigger right. That right to decide for the future of a government, this is a huge thing. And we never really talk about this. You're old enough to vote, but you don't get involved in urban issues. How's that? It doesn't add up. That means you're wasting, or you're not mindful enough about the way that you use your franchise. So I think we need to kind of close the circle here and understand that whether it is the use of technology, or it's the participation in local decision making, or it's the financial health of your own cities, we are at the center of it all. And the youth are more so, because they also have a longevity to look at.
Absolutely.
And one way to think about it is that what I was trying to say earlier is that cities are not about projects, they're not about buildings. But really, actually, cities are great when the spaces in between all of these things, which are the public spaces, are great. So cities are very much about what's between buildings rather than what's inside buildings. And buildings sometimes can be owned in some level by somebody. But the public realm is owned by everybody. And that's really where Jagan is saying that we are all equal.
Got it. Which brings me to the last question, and it's more of a forward-looking question. Let's for a second imagine that it's 2047. We're celebrating 100 years of independence. What would cities look like today, according to both of you? And essentially, in the next so many years, what legacies do we want to leave behind in this journey of urban transformation? We can start.
Okay. So I would say that the first thing is that there's a element of magic really in cities, right? When the government decides that we're going to have a city here, or people create cities, you lay down this grid, you connect it up to different parts. I think there's some magic that happens, because that is really the crucible then for all this interaction, for all this economic development, for this human social development that happens. So I think that cities are really, really important. I think that in 2047, if we can house all our people, if we have open spaces, if we have water, sanitation, really for all of India, we have schools that kids can walk to, we have public transport so that you don't need to own and worry about your own vehicle, your own method of transport. If we can walk and bike a lot so that there's shade around when it's hot, and we maintain our health well, then that really is the vision that I have, where I want my country's cities to be in 2047. So simple, take care of the daily needs, whether they are for shelter, for air, water, basic human needs, for economic development. Once you have the public transit, you can get to work. And of course, then you'll have the tax base to support the cities. And you have parks, playgrounds, social, cultural spaces nearby, so that you can also enjoy your leisure time. That's the hope that I have. I think we can do it in the next years.
Sounds fantastic.
After, in the 80s, there was the National Commission on Urbanization. Now we see a huge push, at least in the government, to think about this issue. So we have to ride on this as citizens. We have to help. We have to cajole. We have to do everything as one ecosystem, again, to make this change happen.
Fantastic.
I think in 2047, I would like to see cities in which the citizens are very aware of the outcomes that they are all benefiting from. So the outcomes of government investment or private sector investment. And those outcomes tend to be very intangible. They're about wellness. They're about health. They're about mental health as well. You need to feel at peace in the city, not feel the agitation and alienation, which is currently, tends to be common. So for me, the indicators will be that a 6-year-old child can walk, safely to their neighborhood school without needing any other assistance, like you can see in cities around the world. I've written about this, so I would love to repeat it. I wrote it in an article in Seminar on Smart Cities in 2015, where I ended it by saying that if a child is in the arms of his or her mother and looks up at the night sky, they should actually be able to see the stars, which is not the case today, right? Because of light pollution and air pollution, children don't get to see the stars in the sky. It's a travesty. I mean, we are depriving our children of that. Right? Very often not even the moon. So they should be able to see that. They should be able to walk safely on the street, go to school together, a group of children like I've seen in the Tokyo subway, they go to nursery school together without any adult having to help them out. So that's how safe our streets ought to be for children, where the elderly, the disabled, all of these are able to access the entire city, and where people have time for leisure, which means that mobility is really fundamental. We waste most of our time in traveling within the city. So you don't have the time to take a Bharatanatyam lesson in the evening, or learn to play the veena, or learn to paint.
Or
That
engage
leisure,
in the city.
or engage in the city, or be part of a
Right.
citizens'
Be
meeting.
part of
We
it.
don't have the time for
Correct.
that. So fundamentally, cities have to give time back to the citizens, where they can choose to do what they want. They can spend time with their family, with their community, develop skills, learn beautiful new things, right? So that they fulfill their full potential. I think fundamentally cities are great when they allow people to do that, which is why I gave you the example of Manhattan. For me, was just like a supreme example of a city in a very, very compact, space, being able to give every individual living there full access to every possibility in the world. And I think that's what Indian cities need to do, to start with, for Indians. And actually, I believe India will be the place where a lot of people from other parts of the world are also going to want to live. If we can clean it up, if we can clean up the city, make it more serviced. I think a place where people can fully tap their creative potential and be part of what is going to be an economy of either the gig economy or a service economy, where the human individual with their skills and their knowledge and their capabilities are going to be they will excel. And I think to do that, we need to actually fix our cities so individuals can
thrive.
Thrive. That's the word, that they can thrive.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jagan. Thanks, Anuj. This was, I think I personally loved interacting with both of you, and it was like an informational session for me. With that, we'll end.